I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at the
I'm Molly, another staff writer at the Atlantic.
And let's start talking about the election, which we've both been covering. And I just wrote a piece about how, for good reason, conservatives have no faith in their nominee. And I was basically responding, I guess, in part to a Peggy Noonan column where she argued that Mitt Romney needed to trust his instincts more and be more confident. And I've seen this from a couple other people in the blog world. And I kind of think that this is exactly wrong, and that Mitt Romney's instincts, if he were to follow them, whatever his true instincts are, which I don't know what they are on any given topic, but I imagine that overall, if Mitt Romney were to follow his instincts, he would just upset conservatives in a lot of ways. And I think that lots of different kinds of conservatives are very distrustful of him, and only by sort of pandering to them and constantly being very careful about what he says and walking back comments that upset them can he keep conservatives on board.
Yeah, I thought this was, I completely agree with your analysis, and I'd say a couple things about it. First of all, Mitt Romney just doesn't seem like a very instinctive human being. There's no evidence that he's ever really let his hair down in his life. We had, his wife and Romney saying at one point, like, oh, he just needs to be unzipped, and we'll see the real Mitt Romney come out. But I don't know if I believe that. If there really is this sort of unleashed version of him that would be so much more authentic in some way. And then you're right, like even if there is an authentic persona, but all the evidence is it's one that his constituency would not like. He's a very smart guy, and he has probably made the correct analysis that he needs to be careful in order not to offend all these people that he needs to support him.
Well, and I find it, I wonder how much his campaign is a reaction against John McCain's campaign 4 years ago, where you had, I think, another situation where the Republican nominee just had a lot of people within the Republican Party who didn't like him all that much, who didn't have particular faith in him, and who, in fact, Romney and McCain are alike in that there have been, months that have gone by in the conservative blogosphere where they've both just been hammered before and held up as the sort of antithesis of what conservatives should want. And it's kind of awkward to be the nominee after all of that, and to have, I guess, more awkward maybe for the conservative writers who now feel the need to say with urgency, no, you need to elect this guy.
Right, yeah, there's that. And then I'm always interested in what lessons Republicans and conservatives have drawn from their experience with McCain 4 years ago. Because there's one school of thought, the sort of political science school of thought, that says, a ham sandwich with a D next to it was going to win that election given the underlying conditions, and it's not really John McCain's fault that he lost. And there's the more sort of strategist-y school of thought that says, well, the campaign was a disaster, and somewhat impacts McCain's personality, but these are sort of non-political or non-ideological considerations. But then a lot of conservatives said, you told us we had to elect, a moderate who could appeal to Democrats, and we did that, and it didn't work. So clearly what we need is, a true conservative, a real right-winger who can really put the big ideas out there, kind of like you hear with some of the outlining for weak buzz, someone who can really make this case from a strong standpoint on the right. I mean, I guess that ship has kind of failed, given that they've nominated Romney, and I don't know how much the VP choice really tempers that. But, and I don't know really what lessons the Romney campaign drew from McCain's loss, except when it came to the primary and figuring out that they could better win the primary right by running to the middle than by running to the right.
Yeah. I just think that it's especially complicated for Republicans because of the way Romney won the primary. It wasn't as if there was a strong conservative alternative that everyone could rally around, and it's almost amazing to me that it came down to Romney and Gingrich and Santorum in the end, because you had this whole populist movement rising up after the 2008 election, and they were all about not compromising, right? They were all about repudiating all of the compromises that they didn't like about the Bush administration, and purity in many ways. And then there you had three guys who weren't that at all. Romney is famous for having changed his positions on various subjects, and I think that he's famous for it partly because he feigned such vehemence both before and after the change. And
so it's not the flip loving, but he's bad at it.
I mean, I think it's both, but I think he is just particularly bad at it because he has this way of just insisting that, he's not just conservative, he's severely conservative. He just has this way of coming off as if he's overcompensating, I guess. Maybe that's just my impression, though, because it seems to work. At least it worked in the primaries. But yeah, Gingrich and Santorum, if you just go back into their records during the Bush administration, they were, complicit in all the things that conservatives said that they didn't like. And then you had candidates that conservatives liked more, like Bachmann and Perry, who pretty clearly weren't viable general election candidates and couldn't even make it through the primaries, seeming credible. So, it's not like if you would have had, Barry Goldwater running, some equivalent to him that everybody in one part of the party would have rallied behind.
Well, it seems to me that part of that is a function of how young the Tea Party still is as a movement, and this general desire for conservative purity, because you do have to have a resume to run for president, and it's possible that anyone who has been in public life long enough will have had to make those kinds of compromises to stay viable, and in that case it's been impossible task, right? No one can stay pure and also get them to a point in politics where they have enough of a resume to be a viable candidate. But it's also possible that this is just a sort of a new strain that hasn't been around long enough to produce candidates who have long enough terms in public life to be credible.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I also think another thing that's going on with the Tea Party is that they there are two ways that you could conceive of sort of fealty to the conservative brand that they want to advance, right? And one way is what kind of policy making that you do. Did you, while you were a governor, do something like the individual mandate, for example? And you can think of a lot of policy areas where Tea Partiers and moderate Republicans have differences. On the other hand, there's the kind of rhetorical approach to judging how much someone is loyal to your brand. And I think that the Tea Party far too often makes decisions based on rhetorical loyalty, based on, Tea Party heroes. I think one example, right? If you look at the record of like Mitch Daniels as governor, or if you look at the record even of blanking on his name, the former Utah governor who went nowhere in the primaries.
John Huntsman?
Yeah, John Huntsman. Both of those guys have records as governor that are more conservative than Mitt Romney, certainly more conservative than the Newt Gingrich of the 2000s. But rhetorically, they're moderates, and they get ripped apart for John Huntsman for cozying up to the mainstream media, and Mitch Daniels for suggesting a compromise on social issues. These small deviations rhetorically that didn't really have a lot to do with substance or how they'd govern as president, but they weren't angry at the mainstream media. They weren't yelling and shouting. They didn't show the tribal loyalty, I guess is what I'm trying to say, that's demanded. And I think that when you demand that tribal loyalty, you're putting yourself in a really dangerous position because anyone can display that, no matter what their record is. It's easy to fake. And I think that what you saw in the last primary was partly an inability to choose because there was an inability to figure out what kind of loyalty, you wanted tribal loyalty or policy loyalty.
Yeah, I do think that the angry tone has a lot to do with it, and the unwillingness to compromise. And when you look at the last batch of Republicans who are elected to the Senate, and then the next batch of Republicans who are about to be elected to the Senate, given what's happened in a lot of these primaries this year, there's a really substantive change that has occurred in the types of Republicans who are being elected. And I think I buy the argument that this is the Tea Party's lasting influence, that they essentially made the right calculation in allowing themselves to be assimilated to the Republican Party rather than continuing to stand outside and critique it, because they've become such a powerful internal force and they have gotten so many subscribers to their philosophy into the highest level now of Republican politics in a pretty remarkably short period of time. I don't know if I would agree with you that John Huntsman is that conservative. I mean, there's a lot of issues where he was pretty clearly a squish. But I guess there's the other question about the Tea Party. Does it represent a sort of pure fiscal conservatism and more the Ron Paul type of libertarian philosophy, or is it a catch-all term for anyone who's just very conservative in any way? You know, do you also have to be very socially conservative, which John Huntsman, for example, is not? And you know, an even older and much more assimilated group within the Republican Party is the social conservatives, and I think they've done a very good job of aligning themselves with the Tea Party, sort of showing the Tea Party where to go, and at the same time kind of co-opting the Tea Party, so that the Tea Partiers are not social conservative agnostics. They have to be just as socially conservative. Look at someone like Michelle Bachmann, who I think started out her campaign thinking she would run on a very new Tea Party, pure fiscal conservatism. We heard her talking about the debt ceiling a lot, and really staying away from the social conservatism that had defined her early career, because she thought that wasn't what people were looking for now. And then as her Iowa campaign sort of got increasingly desperate, she went back to that because there was a constituency for it. She had a lot of credibility on it, and it also was obviously with Santorum absolutely too. It's a group that has a lot of ground troops in Iowa, has a long, decades of history of organizing people and being able to win Republican primaries. So there's just that sort of infrastructure that's built in.
This is actually something that I've noticed in California, and that has driven me crazy in California, the degree to which Tea Partiers have aligned themselves with social conservatives, because state level races in California and even local politics here to a large degree, there's this giant opportunity, I think, for Republicans to come and say, look, Democrats have been in charge, the state is in dire fiscal situation. There are all of these examples of sort of pension excesses and other public employee-related issues that definitely the majority of Californians would be on the side of reform. And yet, every time Republicans run a candidate, every time that they have a primary, they end up wasting a lot of time on social conservatism, on abortion, on gay marriage, and it mystifies me, because I don't expect people to not have opinions or not think that these issues are important. But the prospect of Republicans gaining power in California on a socially conservative platform, or of passing socially conservative laws in California, it's just not going to happen. It's a very blue state, and it's a socially liberal state, and at some point you just have to recognize that and change. But the national brand of the Tea Party has definitely both bled into state level politics and affected strategy, and the alliance between the Tea Party and social conservatives has been evident to me as I talk to people who think of themselves as Tea Partiers, but think that part of what that means is being uncompromising on everything.
Well, I'm not quite saying this, but I've always thought, though, that it's a mistake that a lot of liberals and, to an extent, libertarians make, is they think saying that social issues aren't important or don't matter means that liberal on those issues, right? So if you think abortion doesn't matter, that means you have to be pro-choice, or you have to be in favor of gay marriage. Then isn't it just as possible to say, this isn't my priority, but I'm pro-life?
Right,
this isn't my priority, but I'm against gay marriage. And a lot of conservatives, I think, are coming from that position where even if they recognize that the economy is what's on people's minds right now, and that people don't want to hear a really gross, protracted discussion of like different degrees of partial birth abortion, that doesn't mean we can't have a socially conservative position on those issues.
Right. Well, and I also think that, I guess I think that in a state like California, the national Republican position on gay marriage or on abortion isn't going to be the one that's adopted. That's not to say that there isn't any social conservative insight or social conservative policy that would be acceptable to more than 50% of voters, right? But I don't think that in the realm of social conservatism, at the national level, you see it used as a wedge issue sometimes. You'll see, like, the partial birth abortion ban, for example, as opposed to going after a ban on all abortion or something like that. But at the state level, it's almost always this abstract conversation about the issue overall, gay marriage overall, abortion overall, and very seldom a sort of smaller reform that would push things in the direction of that social conservatives want without winning the whole battle, I guess.
Right. No, that's an interesting thing. It's more of a philosophical, ideological stance, and not something they have any power to change or proposing any specific policy to do anything about.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one thing that I always want to, one argument I always want to make to conservatives is that you're supposed to be the philosophy that thinks that life isn't everything in society isn't about politics, and you should let that give you some space to focus narrowly in the political realm on things that are going to work and pragmatically push things in your direction without feeling like you need to have all of your moral signals come from the political positions you support and the politicians that you elect. It ought to be a pragmatic realm, and that doesn't mean that there aren't moral issues at play, and that you shouldn't advance those moral issues in various ways, but you can advance lots of things in ways other than politics, and I would argue more effectively many times, especially if you're a social conservative in California and you have no prospect, actually, of advancing them through politics.
So you're not going to outlaw abortion anytime soon?
No, not anytime soon. So you wrote a piece that we should talk about. It's about Obama being ahead in some polls, but perhaps not being as well positioned as that would indicate. Why don't you run through it?
Sure. The argument I'm making, this is something Conor Rove devoted his last column in the Wall Street Journal. The headline was, "For Romney, even moves ahead." And this is something that I hear from a lot of Democrats, too, who are sounding a note of caution. There has been a very consistent, it's not even a polling trend because there's no direction to it, there's just this stasis in the polls where Obama and Romney seem to be between 3 and 7 points apart. Obama is ahead. It is not quite accurate to call this tied. There's not really any such thing as a statistical tie, and the election will probably be decided by 3 points or less. But so even if it's within the margin of error, Obama is ahead, Romney's behind. That's the state of the race, and it has been for 2 months pretty consistently. But there's a reason that Republicans like Conor Rove feel like they are well positioned, and there's more than one reason. But Democrats are nervous despite being ahead at this point. Part of it is just the usual caveat that a poll in August does not tell you what's going to happen in November. My favorite saying on this is, if the election were held today, a lot of people would be very confused because we don't usually hold elections in August. So that's part of it. But then there's some very specific factors, and I can remember them all off the top of my head. In brief, there are, number one, Republicans have enthusiasm on their side. There's a clear polling trend showing that Republicans are a lot more excited about voting in this election than Democrats are. Number two, it seems like the drumbeat of economic bad news is going to continue, and every time that's reinforced, I think more and more people question sticking with Obama. Number three, the money. Republicans are going to have a lot more money on their side when you count all the super PACs, and that can make a difference down the stretch when people are paying attention. And number four, Democrats are freaked out about these voter ID and related restrictions on voting that they fear the partisan attempt to suppress the vote that will particularly impact Democratic constituencies in a lot of swing states. So the four reasons that Obama may not be winning, even though he's ahead in the polls.
Great. What do you think? I have no idea, actually. I read your piece. I thought it was a very reasonable and in many ways persuasive argument. I just have no idea who I think is going to win. One thing that confuses me is this simultaneous state of more enthusiasm on the right for this election, and at the same time, lack of enthusiasm for Romney, and it just seems like a negative enthusiasm. It's an anti-Obama enthusiasm. People want to get out and throw him out of office, and I don't know how. I don't know how. I guess I don't know how. Like, as a candidate, would you rather have people enthusiastic for you from an electoral perspective, or would you rather have them antagonistic against your opponent? I don't know which kind of enthusiasm.
I think you'd rather have them enthusiastic. As long as people are fired up to vote, that's the number one thing. And, it might hurt your feelings a little bit, but I think as long as that's the case, you expect that it's not you we're excited about. But, look, Democrats were way more enthusiastic than Republicans about voting in 2004. And it wasn't enough. They were enthusiastic about throwing out George W. Bush. They weren't enthusiastic about John Kerry. And I don't think the reason that John Kerry lost that election was because he didn't get out the race. But it is true that leading an enthusiasm doesn't get you there, especially if it's a negative enthusiasm.
Yeah. I think that, who knows what will happen to the economy in the next few months. It doesn't seem like there's going to be any radical improvement that's going to redound to Obama's benefit. At the same time, if there are lagging economic indicators and people are feeling a little bit better about their life, maybe it's the feeling better about their lives and not the economic indicators that's going to make up their mind when they vote. But yeah, I don't know. It's a tough election to call. I think that's one reason that a lot of people are looking forward enthusiastically to a VP pick, because more than any election that I can remember, and granted I'm relatively young and can't remember so far back in American history from personal experience, but it seems like this election isn't really about much of anything. The arguments that I'm seeing, the arguments that I'm hearing, even when I talk to people who don't follow politics particularly, are about things like, one thing that you mentioned when we were emailing back and forth about this conversation is, are the ads in this election beyond the pale in a way that they've never been before? It's an interesting subject, but it's not anything like the kind of clear distinction in candidates and directions for the country that we saw in 2004 and in 2008.
I think that's interesting, because I feel like this is much more an election where the candidates are running to the left and right, respectively, instead of sort of 2000, 2004, even 2008 style traditional running to the center, trying to get that centrist independent swing vote, which may or may not even exist anymore. I think it's much more an election defined by, clearly distinct ideologies. But there's only one issue in this election. It's the economy. And
right, and
you
I guess
have
that's
two
why
different macroeconomic visions that are not necessarily fleshed out in a lot of honest detail. But so nobody is going out there and proposing a whole slate of other policies because nobody wants to do it. Nobody wants to hear that you're going to do something about healthcare or climate change or anything else because they just want the economy fixed.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, 2004 was an election about Iraq and about how the country responded to 9/11. And 2008 really was another election about that same subject, right? Where you had John McCain, who basically was on board with much of the foreign policy of the Bush administration, who was basically going to keep that going, and who, in domestic policy, was probably going to govern. He wasn't going to govern in a right-wing way, had he been elected. His foreign policy.
I think that's something people forget too often is the extent to which the Iraq War elected Obama.
Yeah, I think absolutely, and it's forgotten partly because conservatives don't want to admit that that's what happened. But so for me, 2004 and 2008, all of these big questions about what kind of country we're going to be after 9/11 and how we're going to respond to it and what kind of wars we're going to fight, and did Iraq even have anything to do with 9/11, and is it a debacle, and should we bring the troops home, all of these things were present. How are we going to get Osama bin Laden? All of these questions were still present. Now, in this election, those things really aren't on the table. There's really not a lot of disagreement. We're going to have this sort of post-9/11 bipartisan consensus that's developed, and Romney or Obama are both going to do a lot of these things that used to be very controversial and that aren't so controversial anymore. There's still a lot of people like me who are yelling about them in the ACLU filing lawsuits and all the rest, but among voters, they're not as controversial as they once were. And on the economy and on domestic policy, Obama and Romney are both running as if the other guy is going to be a sort of an ideologue who takes the country in a ridiculous direction. Romney's going to wage a war on women, and he's going to just give money away to the rich and tank the middle class, and Obama's going to make us another socialist country in Europe. And I just don't buy it. I just think that the difference is 4 or 5 points in the marginal tax rate of people earning more than $250,000. And, I don't want to minimize all of the changes that people make through the bureaucracies and executive orders and all of the rest. But I think this idea that Romney's going to come in and the Republicans are going to successfully push through the Ryan budget is just it's not going to happen. I think that the Ryan budget isn't, people don't want it in the country. I don't think that, people want to, I don't think people want lower taxes for really rich people and cuts to entitlements. I don't think that that's a package the country's going to get behind. I think Republicans know that the country's not going to get behind it too. And I don't know. So we were going to talk about the beefsteaks, and I'm curious about what you think about this. Ezra Klein wrote that piece about how he was basically arguing, why would Republicans possibly want Paul Ryan to be the vice president? The vice president's a powerless position. Paul Ryan can do a lot more in the House. Probably if he's Romney's vice president, he's just going to be co-opted. So what do you think about that?
I thought it was a good piece. And the contention was essentially that it gives them a way to sort of hold Romney hostage to their philosophy because, as you were saying, they don't trust him to hew to it based on his instinct. And also that it makes the election much more a referendum on conservative ideas than, Romney, who was only questionably faithful to those ideas. I think those are both good points. But I think, whether or not Ryan is the vice president or he's in the House, it sort of brings up the same question, which is, I tend to agree with you that Romney would not push policies as far right as Democrats would like to, caricature or tag him with. But the question is, will you have a choice? If Romney's elected, there's about a 0% chance that Democrats retake the House of Representatives, and there's a very good chance that Republicans win the Senate. So if he's working with a conservative Republican House and a sort of Tea Party-dominated Senate majority, does he have any choice but to sign the Ryan plan when they pass it and it comes across his desk? I mean, the House has already passed it in its current configuration. So all that they need is the Senate, and that bill goes to Romney's desk, and he has to decide what to do about it.
You know, I mean, I definitely concede that the shape of Congress has a lot to do with what Romney does. I think a Romney presidency with lots of Republicans in Congress and a Romney presidency with like a very narrow majority looks very different. And, you know, I don't know. I don't know if he signs it in that situation. I think that if he does sign it in that situation, I think that if Republicans actually go forward knowing that they have the votes to pass it and force him to either sign it or not, I think that if he signs it, then they get destroyed 2 years later. I think that they just lose any majority that they had, and I don't believe that they'll do it, and they never have when they've taken power in the past. They've never pursued the economic agenda that they say that they're going to pursue, because they've always known that it isn't popular.
Well, I mean, George W. Bush did try to privatize Social Security. It wasn't the Republicans who stopped him.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, I mean, it's true that he did try and privatize Social Security. I don't know how hard he tried. Certainly,
you think he tried pretty hard?
He certainly didn't try as hard as he tried to pass the surge, right?
Okay.
He tried. I mean, he tried in a sort of. It was he didn't try and sell it to the country. I don't think he didn't. He wasn't willing to put his presidency over the line for it. He didn't believe in it that much. I don't think that Romney believes in the Paul Ryan agenda that much, enough to act against his political instincts and act against his political interests to pass it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't see it. Like, nothing about Mitt Romney's past says to me that he's the kind of guy to make a risky gamble on that paying off. And I'm
two minds about this, because and we are getting into the realm of impossible, mind-reading speculation. Sure, yeah. But I think that Romney is a sort of technocrat, numbers wonk, and someone with a deep, if he has a deep ideological core, it is for this type of fiscal conservatism. And not someone who's, as we've talked about, is a very good or natural politician, so not someone who really has his finger on the pulse of what middle-class Americans do or don't want in this regard. On the other hand, you're right, all the signs point to him being a little more of a moderate deep down and not a hardcore conservative, so I don't know. I mean, to me, the fiscal conservatism that would be core to Romney, that would be deep down in him, I could imagine him being alarmed by high deficits, right? I certainly think that he is pro-business and wants to reduce regulations. I think that is a kind of conservatism that is core to him. But I don't think that reorienting the welfare state in a way that gradually shrinks it and trying to reorient the social safety net in society is a philosophical matter. I don't think that's core to him at all. Romney Care certainly suggests that that's not core to him. And that is what Paul Ryan is about. To be had about the conservatism of Romney Care, which Romney at the time thought he was fixing healthcare in the most conservative way possible.
Well, I mean, I think that I think that the argument that David Frum makes, the conservative case for Romney Care, it has merit to it. It's a plausible case, but it's a very different kind of conservatism, right? The case that David Frum is making, and that a Romney Care supporter might make, is that we ought to have a safety net, that healthcare is an important thing, that in a Hayekian sense, safety net is not incompatible with a free market economy. And so we're going to provide it in this way. We're going to mandate that everyone have insurance because that's a responsible thing to do. And that's the only way that you pay for it. And it's a very different conservative case than what opponents of Romney Care would say, which is that the state has no business doing this. We should have a free market healthcare system. We need to shrink the role of the federal government because it's dangerous to liberty to have the federal government involved in healthcare. We're going to have death panels. Romney's comfortable with technocratic government management of things as long as it's efficient.
Well, I think the conservative case for that type of healthcare reform is that it takes government out of it to the maximum extent possible, but the safety net is not provided by government, it's provided by private companies, and that you do have a mandate to ensure individual responsibility, but you're making people buy something on the private market. You're not creating a new government healthcare system. You're not creating a new government bureaucracy. You're not using government to provide healthcare as a safety net at all. You're trying to get government out of that part of the safety net business instead of the more liberal solution, which would be to have government more involved and to have more of a Democrats like to call Medicare for all type of socialized medicine.
Right, but I mean, so if enough conservatives believed what you just said, Romney could come into this election and he could say the problem with Obamacare isn't that it mandates that people have insurance. The problem with Obamacare is that it mandates the particular kind of insurance they have, and it heaps all of these regulations on what kind of insurance people can have, and it increases, it's a thousands-page long bill that doesn't just do the core thing of getting people insured. It does all of these other things that ruins the private market in healthcare, and I'm going to take away all those other bad things, right? But that's not the case that he's made so far. Maybe he's going to pivot and piss off Eric Erickson and Michelle Malkin, right? And maybe he's going to do that still. So far, he has felt like he hasn't had the space to do that because it's the Tea Party strain of conservatism that he has to satisfy. It's a conservatism that doesn't want the government involved in healthcare and that would prefer that the federal government just stepped out and left it to the states.
Sure, I guess that I'm not necessarily arguing with that. I would say I think the definition of what constitutes a conservative position on healthcare has changed a lot since, Newt Gingrich and the Heritage Foundation embraced the mandate in the 90s.
Absolutely.
And part of the reason that it's changed is that it was embraced by Obama and Hillary Clinton and Democrats.
Yeah, that is part of it. I mean, part of it is also, I think that part of it shouldn't be underestimated. I think part of it is also, though, that if you're a small government conservative or a libertarian, this is a really thorny and difficult issue because, look, insurance as a way to cover medical care itself, to me, is under threat and doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. We're coming up on an era when maybe you can, look at the genetic blueprint of a baby and figure out what kind of cancer that they're likely to get 40 years later, right? So what does that mean? Does it make sense to insure everyone with the same insurance company from 9 months old on? And to, I don't know, I mean, to me...
This is some serious futuristic stuff.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, right, even right now, without going out into the future, you couldn't just have a private insurance market with no government regulation and also have universal health care. It would be impossible, right? And even some conservatives acknowledge that certain parts of Obamacare are popular. For example, the requirement that everybody has to be covered even if they have a pre-existing condition, right? That's very popular with Americans, and for good reason. It's because people feel like insurance companies are too powerful, that left to their own devices, they would just cover people that are relatively healthy and everyone else would be screwed. And I think that that's correct. I don't think that a country like the United States is ever going to have a private market in healthcare. And I don't think that a completely private market in healthcare would necessarily work, right? You won't see a lot of conservatives or libertarians enthusiastic to admit that, but they behave as if they believe it deep down. They just can't really say it, I think. So I don't know.
So we started out this discussion by talking about the Ryan plan and where Romney's instincts are. I think, and I want to make the point that I think we're going to learn a lot about this in the next 90 days before the election, because that's going to be a huge focus, and it hasn't been so far. I mean, part of what we've just been through with this like long, slow summer of quibbling about relative distractions and silly stuff, is that the real campaign hasn't engaged, and a big part of that real campaign that it engages is going to be Democrats attacking Romney on the Ryan plan, whether or not Ryan's on the ticket. And I think we're going to have a huge debate about that, and it's going to be, and it's going to play out down the ticket as well. I think every House Republican already, that's the gist of every Democrat's campaign against them. It's going to be the theme of the Senate campaign. Democrats think they have a winning issue. There are a lot of Republicans who agree with that, and then there are some who don't. So I think it'll be really interesting to see this litigated through the fall, and that'll tell us a lot also about sort of where the popular will is and how much space whoever's elected has on this issue. Especially if Romney's elected, right?
My instinct is that my instinct is that Republicans have to do a better job of persuading people that something like the Ryan plan is the right direction to go. That rather than persuading people, they've focused on building support for it within the Republican Party without doing a hell of a lot to formulate the language that they would need to persuade more Americans that is the route to go. But I think it'll probably be a good thing that it gets litigated and that we see where the public is. So the convention
is all sort of eternal campaign stuff, right? Republicans scaring voters that Democrats are going to raise your taxes, and Democrats are like, no, not, but they kind of are. And Democrats scaring voters that Republicans are going to take away their entitlements, and Republicans being like, no, you're not, but they really kind of are. Yeah. And that's basically every campaign on domestic policy for the last 20 years.
So we're coming up on the conventions, which I've never been to, but you have. So what can I expect when I get to Tampa and Charlotte?
Well, unlike 2008, which is the only time I've been to the conventions, I don't think we're going to want to be outside. I think Tampa and Charlotte in late August, early September are going to be miserable. So I think we can expect the media to take that out on the parties. And everything you've heard is true. It's a big show. It's not like a manufactured news event. There's not, but at the same time, that's too cynical. I'm not actually that cynical. Because, for example, when Sarah Palin stood up at the 2008 convention and made that speech, and improv the line about the pit bull with lipstick, that was a watershed moment in that campaign, and that meant that, like, being there to see that, I feel like with history. And it's interesting because the conversations I've been having with Republicans in the last few days, I've heard from several of them, they really think Romney's convention speech is going to be really, really important. And this is partly because this has been a theme of the conversation. So many on the right feel like Romney's done such a bad job of defining himself. And this is his opportunity where he's in the spotlight, everybody's watching him, and he can really make that sort of definitional statement. But there's a real thing, like there is a lot on the line for Romney, specifically in his speech at the convention. And like I had one Republican tell me today, I'll be able to tell you by the end of his convention speech whether he has a shot.
So do the Republicans that you're talking to think that it sort of bodes ill, or at least that there's a tension at work where, like, Romney's still trying to win over Republicans with his convention speech? Right, I mean, like, ideally...
I don't know if that's what I'm saying.
Ideally, you're nominating...
I don't think the audience is ostensibly Republican.
Right, I don't either. But, like, there's this tension between winning Republicans and winning the general electorate that is at play in every election with every candidate, balancing their party and the need to tack to the center usually. I guess that's not the dynamic in this election, that they're both trying to get at their base and win a certain slice of independence. But, I mean, I guess another way to phrase my question is, do you think that the lack of faith that Republicans have in Romney and the lack of willingness to give him the benefits of any doubts is hurting his ability to win independence?
I look at it a little differently. I basically think he's having the same problem with everybody. Because I don't think this is an ideological thing so much as like a sort of like political strategy, just like, who are you? Do I want to have a, I don't know, glass of milk with you? And do I feel like I know who you are on that level type of thing? And I know that as a drive to political scientists crazy to hear those sort of arguments based on moral intangibles, because they're all convinced the voters are either much more or much less rational. I don't know. So I think it's much more just about like how he can tell his story in a way that resonates and gives a sort of vision to what he stands for. And so I don't think this is about satisfying Republicans or satisfying independents. I think it's more about a unifying statement, unifying in the sense of unifying Mitt, not unifying everyone else out there, but like gives a complete picture that people can understand for what the case is that he's making.
Well, so Romney's going to give a big speech at the Republican convention, and there are going to be other speakers. And, it's going to be much like we see every 4 years on TV. But what about the parts you don't see on TV? What happens?
There's a lot of parties.
So there are parties at night after the speeches end. What about like during the day? What are people doing all day?
Well, I mean, the media is there, and the event is put on for the media in a lot of places, but this is also a party-building exercise, In every state, in every democratic organization, the activists are working their guts off all year, in part so they can get themselves elected to be delegates, and they can get a trip to Charlotte and have this, imagine you're like the one Democrat in your town in Oklahoma, and this is like your one chance in 4 years to be in the center of the action with all of the other Democrats in the country. So it's actually a cool, I'm someone who is really interested in why normal humans who don't have our sickness but get involved in politics and care about it and devote their lives to it for free. And so I'm always really interested to see the activists getting together and sort of basking in that sort of social experience. There's also sort of the old school machine element to it, right, and the workers that all these delegates are elected. And so there's some of these technical things that I think are less and less relevant, like the platform and the rules, and you always have a few people who really care about that stuff. At the Republican convention, Ron Paul is once again staging a sort of counter-convention the way he did 4 years ago. And I'm surprised we haven't heard more of this, but Ron Paul is not getting a speaking slot at the Republican convention, although his son, Rand Paul, is. But he's going to have a lot of delegates there, and it will be up to them whether they make a lot of noise or not. And we sort of saw a couple months ago that Paul did not have a very good leash on those people, and they were causing some havoc at state level conventions. So it'll be interesting to see first what show they put on and how, to what degree it's sort of an anti-Romney convention. I remember when we did this 4 years ago, it was in Minneapolis while the Republican convention was in St. Paul, and it was full of loathing for John McCain, but it was also this sort of countercultural, ideas festival for the libertarians who tend to be very nonconformists and could not be further from the sort of stuffy, elegant British Republican vibe of the actual GOP convention across the river. So,
and of course, one thing that everyone with any sort of civil libertarian proclivities on the right is going to be looking at is Rand Paul at this convention, and I think that he's a guy who is under a lot of pressure trying to sort of marry the some of the ideas and positions of his father to the mainstream of the Republican Party and trying to figure out where exactly he fits in all of it. He endorsed Romney, of course, and then Romney came out shortly thereafter and talked about how he wouldn't need to get congressional approval to attack Iran. And Rand Paul, to his credit, came out pretty quickly and said, "No, you're wrong about that." And in the time since, we've seen this battle going on that we don't really know what's going on inside the Romney campaign with its foreign policy advisors, but we've seen little outbursts of neocons being upset with realists and realists being upset with neocons, and it seems like, from my totally outside read on it, that there's at least more neocon power in there than Rand Paul would be comfortable with. So what does he do you think? What does his role at the convention look like?
Yeah, no, I think, and his role in the party going forward is a really interesting question. I know some people in his sort of operation, and there is a very conscious attempt to position him, as you say, as sort of a bridge, because he is his father's son. He isn't he hasn't been co-opted completely, at least, but he is also a much better politician than his father, and he wants to be much more in the mainstream than his father, and is not quite as much of an ideologue on certain things as his father. And so, I wonder if, sort of like you're saying, if he can make enough sort of political moves to keep himself on the inside so that he can act as sort of a voice of conscience on some of this stuff. He was making similar noises about defense spending, for example, when the Republican Party decided they were going to go after the Democrats and blame them for the defense spending cuts and the sequester trigger. You had Rand Paul out on a limb sort of saying, actually, I think we should cut defense. Those are sincere positions, as far as I know, and he's sort of, I think, being pretty careful about when he can make those stands and when he goes along with his party. It's a really interesting dynamic that, his counterpart in the Kentucky delegation is the majority leader, Mitch McConnell, who is sort of the ultimate establishment Republican. So I guess I don't have a conclusion to this, except that I think it's going to be really interesting to watch him. And it'll be really interesting, too, how much leeway the Ron Paul movement gives him. Because even just endorsing Romney, you heard these shouts of traitor, and it was very clear that they wanted to make sure that he didn't, that they're really ready to turn on him, but they don't have the same loyalty to him that they had to his father. He knows that that's his constituency at this point, and he has to keep them happy too.
Yeah, I think it's very important that they stay ready to turn on him and be very vocal.
Keep him honest.
My notion of politics is that people don't do that nearly enough, and that the constituencies that do that are the ones who get taken care of. I think that...
And this goes back to the discussion of social conservatives, totally.
Yeah, well, and also to, on the left, you've seen gays get taken care of during the Obama administration, and it's because they were vocal and because they made their money contingent on their issues being advanced, and I think that there could have been a little bit more of that from civil libertarians on the left. I think, despite being in a very difficult position right now, Rand Paul has one thing going for him, and I think that is that his idea of what American foreign policy should be is actually much closer to the median Republican voter than you would think from the composition of the party as a whole. I think that there isn't actually all that much... I think that ideological neoconservatism doesn't have very much resonance in America outside of the Beltway and official circles, and that there is this kind of strategic alliance between, between neoconservatives and someone like Dick Cheney, who isn't really an ideological neoconservative. He's just a guy who wants to very aggressively wield American power in a way that I don't think for him is very ideological, right? But there's like an alliance of hawks, is I guess the best way I can put it. I think that Rand Paul's willingness to use force in narrow circumstances and simultaneous general preference for not launching wars is something that has a constituency among Republicans that has kind of been quiet for a long time, and has been quiet really since the Clinton administration, but that maybe could reemerge. And I think that one game that he ought to be playing is thinking about who else he could get into the Senate to help him with that.
Yeah. So when you talk about how much his constituency is willing to let him get away with, I think you may be right that there is a Republican appetite for a less interventionist or less aggressive foreign policy posture, but not necessarily as far as Ron Paul takes it, right? Which is dramatically slashing the military, getting our bases out of every single country that they're in, allowing Iran to have a nuclear weapon. That's where a lot of mainstream Republicans start getting uncomfortable with it. If it's just like, let's not have gone into Iraq, for example, then we would see a lot more people involved. That's where Huntsman was going to position himself. And who knows if that was his problem or if it was all the other stuff, or his general disdain for Republicans as a tribe. My question for you is, when you talk about keeping Rand Paul adhering to this kind of philosophy, are you satisfied with a Rand Paul who is just like less hawkish, or does he have to be as non-interventionist as his father is?
I think that the most important thing that he could do, and the thing that he is doing actually, is to insist again and again that whatever you think about whether we should go to war in a certain country or not, it has to be Congress that makes the decision.
Right.
That foreign policy should run through Congress, that there should be much more oversight of the executive branch, that Congress should protect civil liberties a lot more, that it shouldn't just be left up to the courts to occasionally step in and say you can't do that, that you know, like for example, he's pushing this bill that would require warrants for any kind of drone surveillance that the government does. So I think that doing that kind of thing is great. I think that insisting on Congress is great. You know, if it comes to another situation like Iraq, where the president is pushing for, you know, a major war, and it comes down to a congressional vote, you know, that's going to be beyond Rand Paul's control anyway. He's obviously going to vote against that, and he's not really going to be able to, you know, change a lot of people's minds by himself. But I think pushing things in the direction of Congress declaring war, and also, you know, like the Ron Paul position, you can give away so much of the Ron Paul position without really giving up anything of substance. You know, like if you know, Ron Paul doesn't want American bases anywhere in the world, for example. If in a compromise you can get bases out of the Middle East and we still have some people in Germany and Japan, well, who cares? It's not to say that it's inconsequential, but like compared to having bases in the Middle East, it's inconsequential. So I do think that if, you know, I mean, this is a totally unrealistic issue, but just as a hypothetical, you know, say that Rand Paul was able to get our bases out of the Middle East, but wasn't able to get them out of, or wasn't even willing to fight to get them out of Germany and Japan. Ron Paul people should be satisfied with Rand Paul for that. They shouldn't turn on him for that. And if they do turn on him for that, they're self-defeating.
Would you like to make any comments about the tendency of the Ron Paul movement to be self-defeating?
Well, I don't know. I mean, look, the Ron Paul movement, right? Certainly it's self-defeating in some ways, but the way that it was most self-defeating, right, is Ron Paul's own flaws, and I think that you know, the whole racist newsletter thing was by far the biggest black eye that Ron Paul had. And he was never going to be a guy that was actually going to be president. And given that he was never going to be a guy that was never actually going to be president, he used that process to get his ideas heard in a way that was very successful, I think. I think that, like, given what they were working with, his supporters actually, you know, you could always point to things that they could have done differently. And there are different things that I roll my eyes at. But I don't know. I think that they're a pretty successful political movement.
No, that's actually a good point. And I was thinking about this when I interviewed Gary Johnson recently, because of course his big thing now is trying to get into the debates, and it's clear that, you know, he was pretty unfairly excluded from the Republican primary debates just because he's not viewed as being in the ideological mainstream. But neither is Ron Paul, and Ron Paul just put himself in a place where he couldn't be ignored. And Ron Paul had to fight to get into the debates 4 years ago. But he just, like you say, positioned himself and his movement, did such a good job of organizing that they could not be denied, and there was no question that he would be in all of the debates this time around.
Yeah, and it's very rare, I think, for someone with Ron Paul's philosophy to spend much of their life seeking and being in public office. I don't get the vibe that Gary Johnson is willing to run for president 4 times and only the 4th time build up enough. You know, he just seems like a guy who...
he does say he's going to be around in 4 years, so... But I don't see this as the end point, I don't think.
Yeah, I hope not, because I think that he is, in many ways, the strongest nominee on paper that the Libertarian Party has ever had. You know, but partly just by virtue of holding an office higher than any other Libertarian nominee has ever had.
But he's also, he's for real, right? I mean, I talked to so many Libertarians who feel burned by the Bob Barr experience 4 years ago, when Bob Barr was like, look at me, I was a politician, I was in Congress, and now, even though I was, you know, a drug warrior and stuff, now I really believe all that stuff that you guys believe. So, and they're like, okay, sure, like, you want to take it. And then, like, he pretty much immediately repudiated all of that after losing, and went on to endorse Newt Gingrich in the current election. So, like with Gary Johnson, like, he came out in favor of legalization when he was still governor of New Mexico. That's for real. That's actually
he's definitely for
real on the line.
Yeah, he's definitely for real, and he's also... but I think that despite the Bob Barr experience, libertarians aren't going to have a hard time finding, like, someone that is for real. I think that if, and this is a huge if, libertarians can ever build up enough support to get, like, 10 or 15% of Americans behind them, what Gary Johnson has that very few other libertarians have is this ability to point to New Mexico, right? And every time libertarians are, included in the debates or interviewed on national television, there's this tendency that doesn't happen with conservatives and liberals to find, like, the reductio ad absurdum of their positions, or to find, like, the most extreme consequence of applying libertarian philosophy consistently, as if that would ever happen, even if a libertarian were elected president, right? And to say, well, what about this? And what Gary Johnson can say that no other libertarian who's ever been the nominee could say is, I ran a state for 8 years. It did not implode. We did not cease to have roads. I did not ruin them. I ran even the government agencies that I didn't agree with existing. I ran them well.
Right. And he was still popular when he left.
Yeah, and people still liked him when he left. And so I think that there's a big comfort in saying, look, I'm not just some guy who's going to go in and change everything and everything's going to collapse. I've done this before. I've governed before. It went fine.
So you need that as a third party. You need this sort of proof of concept that you can govern, because the other parties have it.
Yeah,
and you don't.
And you don't. So we are right about an hour, so we should probably quit. But it's been fun, and we should do it again sometime.
It's good to talk to you, Conor. Hope you're enjoying